There is a version of yourself you have always trusted. The one who knows what is right. The one who has sat with enough discomfort to understand, quietly, what kind of person you want to be. You built that version slowly, through small decisions, through things you refused to do even when it would have been easier to look the other way. And then one day, without much ceremony, you did not do what that version would have done. You said the thing that served you instead of the thing that was true. You stayed quiet when speaking would have cost you something. You let someone else take the blame for a situation you helped create, not because you are a dishonest person, but because in that moment, honesty felt like a luxury you could not afford. No one called you out. The situation moved on, but something in you noticed. Not with outrage, with a much quieter feeling, something closer to recognition. That is where this begins. She had always thought of herself as someone with principles. Not in an obvious way. She did not talk about her values often. She did not need to. They lived in her behavior, in the way she gave credit where it was due, the way she told the truth even when it complicated things, the way she stayed loyal to people who had trusted her even when that loyalty had no obvious reward. She had learned early that a lot of people talked about doing the right thing. She had decided, at some point she could not exactly name, that she would simply try to do it. She had built a reputation, inside herself more than anywhere else, as someone who could be counted on. Someone who would not rewrite the story to make herself look better. That reputation was important to her, perhaps more important than she had ever admitted. Then came the project. It had been a difficult year at work, budgets tightening. A round of restructuring that had left people uncertain about what their roles would look like in 12 months. She had watched colleagues she respected become suddenly careful, more measured in meetings, slower to volunteer opinions, quicker to align with whoever seemed to be making the decisions that mattered. She had noticed this without judgment. She understood it, but she had also told herself quietly that she would not become that. She had her values, she had her way of operating. That felt like enough to hold on to. The project was assigned to a small team. She was one of 4 people. The lead was a colleague she respected, someone with strong instincts that had been right often enough to earn real credibility. But early in the project, the lead made a series of calls she thought were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just off. The kind of misjudgment that is easy to miss if you are not paying close attention, but that she could see clearly because she was close to the work. She said so once clearly in a team meeting. She laid out her concern without being aggressive about it. The lead acknowledged it, explained the reasoning behind the decision. The conversation moved on. The decision stood. She let it go. She had done what she was supposed to do. She had spoken up, and then she had accepted the outcome and gotten back to work, which is also, in most professional contexts, what you are supposed to do. Months passed. When the results came in, the lead's approach had not worked. Not catastrophically, no one was fired, no client was lost, but the outcome fell clearly short of what had been projected. In normal conditions, this would have been processed quietly, but these were not normal conditions. The year had been difficult. Leadership was paying attention. The debrief felt different from other debriefs. Her manager was in the room. He asked her directly what she thought had gone wrong. And something shifted. It happened faster than she expected. The shift was not dramatic. It did not feel like a decision. It felt more like a slight adjustment of posture, the way a person might change their footing without consciously thinking about where to put their weight. She did not lie, but she shaped what she said. She spoke about her early concerns in a way that emphasized how clearly she had seen the problem, more than she had actually voiced it at the time. She let the framing suggest she had been more separate from the decision-making than she truly was. She did not volunteer the fact that she had ultimately complied, had put genuine effort into executing a plan she doubted, had not pushed harder after that first meeting, had not escalated when she had the chance. What she offered instead was the version where she had been the quiet voice of reason, half ignored, watching things unfold with well-founded skepticism. The skepticism had been real, but the distance she implied was not. The conversation moved on. No one dug deeper. She walked out of the room having protected something, her image, her standing, maybe her position in a year when positions were not guaranteed. She told herself it was mostly true, that she had earned the right to frame things in her favor given how little credit she had received along the way. But that night, sitting with the quiet of the evening, something settled in her chest that would not quite move. Not guilt exactly. Guilt announces itself. This was quieter, more like an accounting. She had just been the kind of person she had spent years deciding not to be. And no one would ever know except her. Step outside the story for a moment. What was she actually protecting in that room? On the surface, reputation, career. The image she had in her manager's eyes during a year when images mattered, those things were real, the stakes were real. But beneath the surface calculation, something else was operating. Something she had never quite put into words because it had never needed to be examined. The belief that being a principled person would protect her. Not as a conscious strategy, not as a transaction she had worked out, but as a quiet assumption embedded in the way she moved through the world, the idea that if she did things right, held to her values, kept her integrity intact, the world would in some proportional way be fair to her. That decency had a kind of insulation built into it, that there was a causal link between being good and being safe. She had never said this out loud because it would have sounded naive. She was not a naive person, but the assumption did not need to be spoken to be operative. It lived in the background, shaping how she interpreted risk, how she measured herself, how she justified the small costs of honesty over the years. And when the situation made clear that her decency might not protect her, that being good might not be enough, that she could hold her values and still lose ground to people who did not bother, the assumption collapsed. Quietly, like something that had been leaning for a long time finally giving way. What she did in that debrief was not simply a moral failure. It was what happens when the story a person tells about who they are runs directly into the conditions that story was never designed to handle. This is not unusual, and the world does not discourage it. Most professional environments reward a particular kind of self-presentation, the ability to position yourself favorably, to frame your contribution in the most advantageous light, to move through rooms with a version of yourself that is curated, not fabricated exactly, but selected. The parts that serve you, offered forward. The parts that do not, quietly managed, kept below the threshold where they might cost you something. This is not considered dishonest in most contexts. It is considered skilled. The person who knows which aspects of their thinking to emphasize, who understands how narratives about performance are constructed, that person is often described as strategic, professional, mature. And so people learn, gradually, without anyone ever teaching it directly, that the self they project and the self they experience privately are two different things. That this gap is normal. That managing it is part of functioning in any environment where other people's perceptions of you have material consequences. Relationships operate on a similar logic. You do not say everything. You do not reveal every doubt, every inconvenient fear, every moment where you acted from insecurity instead of confidence. You present a version that holds together, stable, the kind of person others can rely on, can trust, which requires, quietly, that you manage what you make visible. The world trains people in this over a long time, and it does not just train them, it rewards them for it. The ones who maintain their presentation under pressure are the ones who tend to survive. So when the pressure came, when the stakes were real, the situation ambiguous, the cost of full honesty genuinely high, she did exactly what years of operating in that world had prepared her to do. She adapted. The adjustment was not entirely a conscious choice. It was also a reflex. The automatic narrowing of what she offered, the instinctive selection of the narrative that protected her, that was not a strategy she assembled in the moment. It was something she had been building the conditions for, without knowing it, for a long time. The assumption she carried, that values protect you, was not just hers, it was borrowed, built from a culture that praises integrity loudly and then in private rooms and small moments makes clear that there are limits, that the praise is real but conditional, that when the situation is genuinely difficult, everyone is working out the same calculation. She had simply arrived at the moment where the calculation became unavoidable. Niccolo Machiavelli was not writing a manual for villains. That is the misreading people reach for because it makes him easier to dismiss. He was doing something more uncomfortable. He was describing the world as he had actually watched it operate, not the world people wished existed, not the world that moral instruction promised, but the world that showed up every day in the behavior of real people under real conditions. The gap between those two things, he understood, was where most of the damage happened. Not from evil, but from the collision between expectation and reality. Machiavelli observed that human beings are not simply moral or immoral in any fixed sense. They are creatures responding to conditions, living inside systems that reward certain behaviors and penalize others, often independently of the character of the person inside them. A principled person placed in conditions that punish principle will eventually make strategic calculations. This is not proof that their principles were false. It is proof that principles, like everything else, exist inside systems they did not design. He was particularly attentive to the distance between appearance and reality, the way people described their decisions versus how those decisions were actually made. And he noticed something that made most people uncomfortable. The ones who survived over time were not always the most virtuous. They were the ones who understood the distance between image and substance, and who did not confuse the two. He was not celebrating this, he was naming it. Another current running through his thinking was the way people construct stories about their own conduct. He understood that the mind is not a neutral observer of its own behavior. It is an interpreter. It takes what a person actually does and assembles a version of events that the person can live with, a version that preserves the self-concept even when the behavior contradicts it. Not because people are dishonest by nature, but because the mind is very good at finding reasons, at building the case for the version of events that allows a person to remain the protagonist of their own story. She had told herself that what she said in that room was mostly true, and parts of it were. But the construction, the selection, the framing, the distance she allowed to form between herself and what she had actually done, that was not truth. That was the mind doing what Machiavelli understood it would do. The interesting question, he would say, is not whether this happened. The interesting question is what conditions made it feel necessary, and what she had believed, going in, would exempt her from them. Look at what happened again, but from a different angle. She did not betray her values because they were secretly hollow. The values were real. The care she had taken over years, the small moments where she told the truth when it was easier not to, where she gave credit when she could have held it, all of that was real. It had not been performance, it had been genuine. What happened was something more specific than betrayal. Her values had been formed and practiced in conditions where holding them did not cost very much, where the stakes were within a range she could manage, where being honest might be uncomfortable but was not, in any deep sense, dangerous. And in those conditions, over many years, she had come to believe something that felt like self-knowledge but was actually something more limited. She believed she knew what she would do under pressure. But there are different kinds of pressure. The pressure of a difficult conversation is not the same as the pressure of a year where your position feels uncertain and someone in authority is asking you to account for your judgment. She had passed smaller tests. The harder test was different, not in kind but in degree. And degree, it turns out, matters enormously. Machiavelli understood that virtue is not a fixed possession. It is not something you acquire and then keep. It is something that requires certain conditions to sustain conditions that are sometimes present and sometimes not. A person who operates with integrity when the cost is manageable is not the same as a person who operates with integrity when the cost is genuinely high. Both might call themselves principled. Only the second has actually been tested at that level. She thought she knew who she was. What she found in that room was not a different self. It was the same self, running into a level of pressure she had not encountered before, and discovering that the version of herself she had relied on was built for a different range of conditions than the one she was now inside. This does not mean everything she believed about herself was false. It means she had been measuring herself against the wrong standard, and now she had more accurate information. The question that follows is not whether she is a good person or a bad one. That framing collapses something complicated into something too simple to be useful. The real question is whether she can sit with what actually happened, not the version she can live with most comfortably, but the full account, and let that be what she knows about herself going forward. Most people, when they do something that contradicts their self-image, find a way to adjust the story. They emphasize the gray area, and there usually is one. They remind themselves of the complexity of the situation, how much worse it could have been, how many other people would have done exactly the same thing or worse. Some of this is true. Most difficult situations are genuinely complex. But the quiet feeling that follows, the one she felt that evening, sitting alone with no one to perform for, that feeling does not respond to those adjustments. It does not quiet down when you add context. It stays, not as punishment, not as accusation, just as information. It is a kind of honesty the mind produces even when the mouth does not. It says you know what happened, the room is empty, no one is watching, but you know. What that feeling points to is not simple guilt. Guilt tends to be loud and circular. It wants something, resolution, apology, absolution. It loops because it is looking for an exit. This is something steadier, more patient. It is the self witnessing itself, not harshly, not theatrically, but clearly. A kind of internal record that does not require anyone else to acknowledge it in order to exist. The awareness that something happened, that she participated in it fully, that the participation mattered even if no one else saw it. What it asks for, if it asks for anything at all, is honesty that stays private. The kind that does not need to be performed for an audience or witnessed by anyone else. Just acknowledged internally as the accurate version of what occurred. The recognition that values are not immune to pressure. That identity, even carefully constructed identity, is not a sealed container. That the distance between who you believe yourself to be and who you are when conditions shift, that distance can be larger than you expected. And discovering that is not the same as learning that you are a bad person. It is learning something true. Sitting with that is not comfortable. But it is not supposed to reach a resolution either. You do not betray your values because they were never real. You betray them because you meet conditions they were never built to survive, and you discover that integrity, like everything else, has a price point. That knowledge is not the end of something. It does not mean the values are gone or that the person who held them was always a fiction. It means something simpler and harder at the same time. That being principled is not a permanent state you arrive at and then keep. It is something you choose again, each time the cost of choosing it becomes real. Most of the time, the cost is manageable. Most of the time, people choose well. And sometimes they do not. The only thing that separates the person who moves through that honestly and the person who does not is whether they let themselves see it clearly. Not to suffer over it, not to perform regret, just to know. To carry the full account, including the uncomfortable parts. And to let that knowledge be the thing that shapes the next moment, not with urgency, not with resolution. Just with a little more clarity about what they are actually working with.